On February 23, 1991, a young woman's body was found in Goose Lake Wildlife Preserve in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, by a guy walking his dog. She was partly decomposed, yet obvious signs of trauma were still visible. She had been severely battered about the head and chest, and her throat had been slashed. Her legs were spread and her shirt pulled up to expose her breasts. She had been sexually assaulted after death. Strangely, her hands had been severed and were later recovered by hunters, lacking fingertips. On March 15, 1991, a morgue photograph was downloaded into a computer, and a visual image of what the young woman might have looked like in life was created to assist detectives with identifying her remains. The sad story received national coverage, but no leads were forthcoming. Weeks later, a woman who had seen the poster of her believed she might know the identity of the dead girl. The woman informed police she believed this girl had been seen with a pimp named Joseph White. In 1990, White had recruited a young woman to work for him. One day she vanished. The woman had run away from a group home and straight into the arms of Joseph White. The group home's administrator saw the photographs of the missing girl, and she identified her as 16-year-old Doris Ann McLeod. Police discovered that McLeod was sexually abused as a child and eventually lived in 17 foster homes. From the beginning, McLeod experienced problems with White. She didn't want to prostitute herself. It wasn't the life she hoped to find in the city. June 18, 1991, detectives arrived at White's house in a Milwaukee inner-city neighborhood. They entered by the front door, but cowardly White exited by the back, leaving his 3-year-old son behind. Inside the filthy, unkempt house, police discovered clothes and jewelry belonging to McLeod. However, this evidence remains largely circumstantial. White's 3-year-old son suddenly tugged on the flashlight on a detective's belt, curious about the object. He wanted to play with it. When the child, Joseph Jr., was shown a picture of McLeod, he said, "That's Dee." He told the officers that the monster in the house hurt her. Little Joseph Jr. led the police downstairs to McLeod's makeshift bedroom. He pointed the flashlight to steam pipes in the ceiling and explained that he saw Dee hanging from the pipes, telling the men how the monster had bit her fingers. This is crucial evidence, as McLeod's hand was found missing her fingertips, information that was never released to the public. The adorable little boy then stated, "I heard the monster. God damn it, why don't you go upstairs? Now get out of here." Detectives believed this was where McLeod was tortured and possibly killed. Upstairs, they found a pad of paper on which there was a gang pad that contained the rules for the gang. They read on this pad that 50 to the chest was the punishment for a girl who no longer wanted to be a prostitute, and that this was conducive to the wounds on Doris's body. Joseph White was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole until he's 108 years old. On December 31, 1989, Noreen Boyle, wife of a popular and charismatic doctor in Mansfield, Ohio, disappeared. Noreen had been married to her husband, John Boyle, for 22 years. They have a son, 11-year-old Collier, and 2.5-years-old Elizabeth, who they adopted from Taiwan. A good friend of Noreen reported her missing when she hadn't shown up for their lunch date. Police investigating her disappearance found that John Boyle had numerous affairs during their marriage, and that he had bought a house in Erie, Pennsylvania for his pregnant mistress, intending to move in. Police also found that Noreen had asked for a divorce prior to her disappearance. Police suspected it's more than a missing persons case and believed Noreen is probably a victim of foul play, so they interviewed Collier privately about the night his mother disappeared. Collier said that at about 3:15 a.m. of December 31st, he heard his parents arguing, and then later he heard a big thud coming from the room of his parents. Shortly after that, he heard his father walking down the hallway towards his room. He said his father opened his door, looking at him for a long period of time as if he was checking on him. Collier pretended to be asleep. The next morning, his father told him that his mother had left on a vacation. Collier also said that after his mother went missing, his father went on back-and-forth trips from their home in Mansfield to his new house in Erie, Pennsylvania, and that after his father came back from Erie, his shoulder and arms were very sore, and he asked Collier to rub liniment oil on him. Police checked on local businesses and found that John rented a jackhammer and had also purchased a roll of indoor-outdoor carpet a few days before Noreen disappeared. The retailer who sold John's new home in Erie told investigators that he asked to lower the floor in the basement so his kids could play basketball. 26 days after Noreen disappeared, police got a search warrant for John Boyle's new home in Erie, Pennsylvania. They went to check the basement, where they saw the floor had been recently painted gray and new shelves installed at one end. When police went looking around, they noticed the floor was recently filled with concrete and that it's soft, so they pulled up the carpet and began digging. Police found Noreen's badly decomposed body, her head covered with a plastic bag and wearing a Rolex watch. The watch had stopped on December 31st, the day Noreen disappeared. Police concluded that John struck Noreen in the head, then suffocated her by putting a plastic bag over her head. John Boyle was arrested, and his son Collier testified against him in 1990. He was found guilty of the murder and was sentenced to life in prison. In 2011, 22-year-old Victoria Perez, who was due to give birth in about a month, disappeared after a doctor's visit at Rapide Regional Medical Center in Louisiana. Victoria was last seen walking on Interstate 49 at the Woodworth exit on March 11th. The day before, she was seen at the Rapide Regional Medical Center. After the appointment, Victoria called the van transportation company to pick her up and bring her home. The van was delayed, and by the time they got there, Victoria was gone. The case remained cold until January 2015, when the Allen Parish Sheriff's Office received a tip that led them to a home on Matthew Street in Oakdale. It was there that her remains were found. It all began when a woman named Pamela Causey Fregia was desperate to stop her husband from leaving. She claimed she was pregnant, and she showed him a fake pregnancy test. He didn't believe her and moved to another state. Causey Fregia continued with her lie, sending him fake sonogram photos. Months passed, and Causey Fregia realized she needed a child. She traveled to a hospital with her daughter and tried to find an infant. Instead, she found Victoria Perez, who was 8 months pregnant. Causey Fregia lured Perez to her home with the promise of free baby clothes. When the pair arrived, Causey Fregia killed Perez by blunt force. She then tried to cut the baby out of Perez but failed. Causey Fregia took Perez's body down the road to a wooded, family-owned property. She spent several days burning the body, and then she burned the remains. 4 years later, Causey Fregia's own children turned her into the police. Police sent cadaver dogs around the property, and they discovered Perez's remains. Causey Fregia was February 2nd, 1991. A 78-year-old grandmother named Lucille Johnson was found bludgeoned to death in her Holiday, Utah home. According to police reports, she was found dead by her daughter the very next day, and her body had been battered and her bloodied face was covered with a pillow. Interestingly, investigators at the time found Lego bricks on Johnson's living room floor, in the home's entry, and on the driveway. Detectives collected the toys as evidence after family members told them that while Johnson had toys for her grandchildren, she would never leave them lying around. Investigators also learned that a ring and necklace Johnson regularly wore were missing. An autopsy revealed that Johnson died from strangulation and blunt force trauma. Salt Lake County Sheriff's investigators worked on the case but were unable to solve it. In August 2013, a team led by Unified Police Sergeant Michael Ike Miyashiro reopened the case. The detectives sent scrapings that had been collected from under Johnson's fingernails for DNA testing, and recovered a profile that matched a combined DNA index system profile for a 47-year-old John Sansing, a man who is currently in prison in Arizona for another murder committed in 1997. Investigators also matched fingerprints from the Lego toys gathered during the original investigation with one of Sansing's children, who was 5 years old at the time of the killing. Police believed that the child was used to gain entry and that Sansing and Johnson previously did not know one another. The woman was discovered in an Ohio river under ice. She had been strangled to death, and most of the evidence had been washed away by the rushing water. A check of missing persons reports identified the woman as 32-year-old Margie Coffey, a single mother of 2 young children. She had been reported missing 10 days earlier. The autopsy revealed that she had been strangled with her own scarf. The coroner estimated she had been dumped in the creek 10 days earlier, the same day she disappeared. Police investigating the case found that Margie had a relationship with a married police officer named Charles Oswald. And investigators who examined Margie's body and clothing discovered some fibers found on her leg warmers that matched the unique carpeting in Charles's cop car that night. But this evidence is just circumstantial. Police wonder, what is the motive? Police found out that when Margie applied for financial aid at college, she was required to identify her second child's father. She named Charles Oswald as the father. A paternity test was administered and came out to be 99.98% positive. Investigators also discovered that Charles had refused to pay for child support when Margie asked. Another woman who claimed to be Charles's new mistress said that Charles told her about the murder of Margie Coffey. She stated that Charles and Margie were together in a car talking about child support. Charles offered Margie $3,000, but she said it's not enough. Charles got angry and started to yell, calling her obscene names, and she responded by slapping him across the face. Charles then reached over and strangled Margie in the cop car and put her lifeless body into the back seat of the car. He then drove to a creek nearby and threw her over a bridge, in hopes that all the forensic evidence would wash away downstream. Charles Oswald was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and abusing a corpse. He was sentenced to 10 to 25 years in prison.
Group charged with taking the lives of 3 individuals at 2 separate Jewish facilities back in 2014. He was arrested, with court proceedings lasting a number of months. However, his case dramatically shifted in December of that same year, when Frazier blurted out a confession in the courtroom claiming responsibility for his crimes. He was ultimately given the death penalty and remains on death row to this day. Take a look at a short clip.
Mr. Frazier does understand the nature of the proceedings and is capable of assisting counsel in his defense. So we will move forward at this point then.
74-year-old Frazier Glenn Cross was quiet during this part of the hearing, but then the judge set a preliminary hearing date for March, and the outbursts began.
What about my speedy trial?
Cross is accused in the April attacks at the Jewish Community Center and at Village Shalom Retirement Community. 3 people were shot to death: Dr. William Corcoran, his grandson Reed Underwood, and Terry Lamano, who was visiting her mother at the retirement center. Cross is an avowed white supremacist, and at one point he was the leader of the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina. As he was wheeled out of court today, he confessed to the shootings and said his reason was hate.
I attacked the Jewish sisters of Jews against genocide against white people. I have a right. Jesus would do what I did.
Mother of 4 has been accused of taking the lives of 2 of her young children, then stuffing their bodies in a freezer in the midst of a custody trial, claiming she was an unfit mother. By July of 2015, she had been accused of torturing and beating her 9-year-old son to death, as well as suffocating her 13-year-old daughter. Within a year, she admitted guilt for her crimes in court and was sentenced to life in prison. Take a look at her extremely emotional courtroom outburst that led to her conviction.
In a lightning bolt of emotion, Michelle Blair admits to killing her 13-year-old daughter, Stoney Blair, because she believed the teen and her 9-year-old son, whom she's also accused of murdering, had been harming her youngest child. Blair is charged with their murders, but the trial that began today is about the state attempting to terminate Blair's parental rights to her 2 surviving children.
What happens when your kids come to visit you in 2005? Sister gave him a bath, seen whips on her back.
Who's seen whips?
My sister.
Your sister. Did you see these whips?
She showed them to me.
Are these long red marks?
No, they was healed up by the time I seen them.
Healed up. But do they appear to be long, like lines?
No, it's like slashes.
Another one of Michelle Blair's outbursts came as an attorney for one of the fathers was addressing the court.
So I asked the court not to be so inflamed by the mother's actions as to place those on my client. The allegations against my client, Mr. Berry, are failure to protect and abandonment.
And never being there for his kid.
Mother,
She was
stop.
always on sex sites, though,
Mother,
right?
mother, listen to me.
I had to beg you to come see me. For real?
Mother, listen to
No
me.
matter how much you lie or how your lawyers lie.
You done, mother? Listen to me. This is a civil case. It's not a criminal case. We can and we will do it without you.
I never
We
tried
will
to say I
do it
didn't. I
without
did it,
you.
but that does not negate the fact that they were never there for their children. I had to struggle with them all the time. They were never there.
You get
Steven,
your
you
chance.
know we had to beg you. Me, Steven, all of us used to cry for you.
You're not going to be able to
I'm
stay,
good.
mother.
Come here.
There are rules.
Highly familiar with Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, responsible for taking the lives of 10 individuals between 1974 and 1991. Though surprisingly few people have seen or heard his courtroom confession, leading to his guilty verdict. On June 27, 2005, Dennis Rader was heard on live TV acknowledging his crimes for the very first time, claiming responsibility for his actions. Take a look at a clip from the court proceedings.
Mr. Rader, I need to find out more information. On that particular day, the 15th day of January, 1974, can you tell me where you went to kill Mr. Joseph Otero?
I think it's 1834, Edgemore.
All right. Can you tell me approximately what time of day you went there?
Somewhere between 7 and 7:30.
This particular location, did you know these people?
No, that's no, that was part of my, I guess my what you call fantasy. These people were selected.
All right. So you
Okay.
you were engaged in some kind of fantasy during this period of time?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, when you use the term fantasy, is this something you were doing for your personal pleasure?
Sexual fantasy, sir.
I see. So you went to this residence, and what occurred then?
Well, I had did some thinking on what I was going to do to either Mrs. Otero or Josephine, and basically broke into the house, or didn't break into the house, but when they came out of the house, I came in and confronted the family, and then we went from there.
All right. Had you planned this beforehand?
To some degree, yes. After I got in the house, I lost control of it, but it was, you know, in the back of my mind, I had some ideas what I was going to do, but I basically panicked that first day, so.
All right. When you went into the house, what happened then?
Well, I confronted the family, pulled a pistol, confronted Mr. Otero, and asked him to, you know, that I was there to, basically I was wanted to get the car. I was hungry, food, I was wanted, and asked him to lie down in the living room. And at that time I realized that wouldn't be a really good idea, so I finally, the dog was the real problem, so I asked Mr. Otero if he could get the dog out, so he had one of the kids put it out. And then I took him back to the bedroom.
You took who back to the bedroom?
The family, the bedroom, the 4 members.
All right. What happened then?
At that time I tied him up.
While still holding him at gunpoint?
Well, in between tying and yes. Yeah.
All right. After you tied them up, what occurred?
Well, they started complaining about being tied up, and I re-loosened the bonds a couple of times. Tried to make Mr. Otero as comfortable as I could. Apparently had a cracked rib from a car accident, so I had him put a pillow down for his head. Had he put I think he Parker or a coat underneath him. They talked to me about giving the car and whatever money. I guess he didn't have very much money. And there I realized that, I didn't have a mask on or anything. They already could ID me, and made a decision to go ahead and
Israel Keyes admitted to taking the lives of over 10 people, burying at least 3 of them in Washington, and submerging countless others in an unknown lake. In 2012, Israel conducted a series of interviews with the FBI, in which he revealed a small amount of information about his victims, including where to find a few of their bodies. However, before his case could be closed and him be properly convicted, he took his own life while in jail. Take a look at a short clip from a news piece that aired about Israel back in 2012.
When I was smart, I would let them come to me. Just remote area. Come go to a remote area that's not anywhere near where you live, but that other people go to as well.
The police interrogation is in Anchorage, Alaska, where Keyes was being held for the murder of 18-year-old barista Samantha Koenig, seen here putting her hands up the very moment a masked Keyes pulls a gun on her. He zip ties her hands and leads her away from the coffee stand, telling police he killed her, then left to take a cruise out of New Orleans before asking her family for ransom. Gruesome as it is, Keyes wasn't done talking. In fact, the man who matter-of-factly confessed to raping and murdering Koenig left investigators stunned by telling them he's a serial killer.
There is no one who knows me, or who has ever known me, who knows anything about me, really. I'm 2 different people, basically.
How long have you been 2 different people?
Long time. 14 years.
Keyes said enough to start a massive investigation, but he didn't tell them everything. Sunday, they found his body. He'd killed himself with a razor inside his jail cell. One final act of
Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, confessed in 2013 to taking the lives of over 80 women, a number that doubled investigators' estimates of just 40 women. During his sentencing, Gary was only charged for his involvement in 49 of his crimes, though after his conviction is when he openly admitted that there were many, many more victims. The clip you're about to see is from a woman who was employed by the FBI to assist in getting Gary's confession. Take a look.
My strategy was to get him talking and to have him do most of the talking. How are you this morning?
Pretty good. Slept real good. A little toss and turning, but pretty good.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I would also sit very close to him so that I could maybe touch his elbow and say, Gary, tell me what it feels like.
The questioning goes on for weeks. Some sessions last for hours.
Turn him off and he will not talk. And your goal is to keep him talking.
And finally, something within Gary Ridgway cracks. Bit by bit, he starts talking.
I don't know if it started at an early age, but sex and hurting the woman.
And he loved being able to talk, finally, after all these years. And in doing so, he kind of walked us down the path of all of his murders. At one point, Gary referred to himself as something like the lean, mean killing machine. And he was very efficient, like a machine. Explain that process to me.
Let's say she's always in the car, driving down the road. So I whipped out my ID, and with my ID would be I'd put my finger over my driver's license to hide my name. Mm-hmm. But on the opposite side was pictures. And a picture of my son. They would know I was a kind of normal person.
But you were really using your son as part of your ruse.
The girls would think Ridgway was a kind family man. They had no idea they were setting off with a serial killer.
And he would drive up to them, and sometimes he'd even have his son's toys in the front seat, and that would be a very effective ruse to convince these women that, hey, I can't be that serial killer. I've got my little boy's toys in the car. He was a very normal, kind of vanilla type looking person, and there was nothing that stood out about him. Not dangerous. He could have been anybody living next door. He was anybody living next door.